Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillahi wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillahi amma ba'd. So inshallah, brothers and sisters, we'll continue our discussion of existence of God from an Islamic perspective. So if you recall what was the summary of our last session, we discussed that this universe with all of its existences, any of the objects of the universe, obviously universe is a collection of different objects, and every single object in this universe is contingent, which means that universe as a whole is contingent. And then we concluded with many examples and analogies that a series of contingent objects cannot exist without a necessary foundation. Before I continue, I just want to mention one thing which is very important. Because sometimes atheists, they accused us, they say that even if we accept that there is a necessary foundation, it does not mean that you have proved God. We completely agree with them. So far, we have not claimed that we have proved existence of God or any God, either Abrahamic understanding of God or any God. But what we have established so far is that there has to be a necessary foundation, otherwise this dependent, needy existence cannot exist. It can neither come into existence and nor can it stay in existence. So this is what we have established so far. This would be a second stage when we move from this necessary foundation and we establish that this necessary foundation cannot be anything within the universe. It cannot be any blind force, energy, or laws of nature or anything. Rather, it can only be a God with a will. And inshallah, we will definitely discuss this because this was very important. So you should be clear, and when you talk to people, you should make them clear as well. That so far we have only established existence of a necessary being or a necessary foundation. That's it. Now let's inshallah move to the topic of inshallah today's session. You might have seen that in my message I mentioned that inshallah in today's session I will discuss those objections which people do raise up till this point when you are basically proposing a necessary foundation. At this stage they are going to come up with certain objections, and some of those objections are very important to be understood, and we should see that how should we address those objections. Okay, so let's inshallah continue. So first of all, this is, I just try to paraphrase their objection, that why we have to jump from a necessary being, why we have to jump to a necessary being or a supernatural explanation while science is gradually explaining everything through natural processes. This is a summary, or this is in a nutshell how they raise different objections. So one more time, they say that why is it that, yes, we agree with you that that science has not explained every single thing, but it does not mean that you immediately jump and you try to propose a necessary being, because science will eventually explain every single thing. So we don't need to propose or posit any necessary being. So let's inshallah see that is this objection a valid objection, and if it is a valid objection, then how to address this objection. Science eventually will explain every single thing. So we are not in need of any supernatural explanation. Okay? Now, the way they postulate this argument or objection is, they say that actually belief in God was a result of man's ignorance of the functioning of our universe. Which means that in the ancient times, in the pre-scientific era, there were so many gaps. This word gaps is very important. They say that in the pre-scientific era, there were so many gaps in our understanding of the universe. And the ancient man, they basically squeezed God into those gaps as explanation. And this is they call God of the gaps. Which gaps? Gaps in human understanding of the functioning of universe, and human beings, they squeeze God into these gaps. And now, with the passage of time, science is explaining all of those gaps and all of those phenomena through natural processes, and removing all of those gaps from all of those gods from the gaps with naturalistic explanation. And eventually a time will come when there will be no more gaps in our understanding, and hence no more room for this God of the gaps. This argument is normally called in the atheistic world as God of the gaps argument. Clear? I think inshallah you will understand what the objection is, because understanding the objection is very important. Okay? Now let's see inshallah how we will deal with this objection. Let me give you some examples that what they are actually saying here. Let's take one example of solar eclipse. Okay? They say that, for example, in the ancient China, the Chinese people, they used to have this superstition, this belief that solar eclipse happen because there are some dragons, sun-eating dragons, and they are eating the sun, and this is how the solar eclipse happen. And then in order to please their those dragons, they would beat the drums and they would do certain things so they can please those dragons and they can stop them from eating the sun, because they would understand that our existence on earth is dependent on sun. So this was their understanding. Now if you notice at these key things, so basically what we are learning in this example is that belief in God was a result of man's fear. Very important. And it was not based on any evidence. And it was a result of man's ignorance to understand the natural phenomenon, which in this case, solar eclipse. And hence, this was a superstition. And don't forget this point. From an atheistic point of view, all of our belief are superstitions in the same way as sun-eating dragons was a superstition of the ancient Chinese people out of their fear and ignorance, and it was not based on evidence. And then what happened is, this is what happened. With the scientific era, with the scientific development, now science has given us a naturalistic explanation. Because remember this point, dragons eating the sun, that was a supernatural explanation. And now we know that there is no such thing as dragons eating the sun. It is the rotation of the celestial bodies which is causing all of this eclipse, as you can see in this image as well. So basically, what ancient people used to say, that was supernatural explanation. And what science has offered us today is called natural explanation. And that one was based on fear, and this is based on curiosity. That we wanted to know that how things are happening. That was based on no evidence, and this is based on evidence. That was out of ignorance, and this is based on knowledge, and that is what is called science. Please understand all of these things. This is where they are operating from. That science versus superstitions. Beliefs are synonym to superstitions, and science is equal to evidence, fact, and rationality. Clear? So now they would ask us, where is the room to adjust any supernatural explanation? Because you can say that apparently their case is that supernatural explanation. Either some people used to believe that dragons eating the sun, and Vietnamese used to believe that there are some frogs, they are eating the sun. So they said no matter what you say, it could be any supernatural. But now because we have a naturalistic explanation, what is the need of any supernatural explanation? That is their point of view. Let's understand it a bit further. For example, understand the phenomenon of rainfall. Obviously, once upon a time, we were not having sufficient knowledge to explain this process of rainfall. So we started to say, the people of religion, we started to say that, God sends down rain. Clear? And what happened after scientific advancement? Now we understand what we call today as water cycle. That how, heat of the sun making the water into vapors and all of this process. So they would say that now when we understand exactly this process of rainfall, what is the need of any supernatural explanation, i.e. God? This is their question. Now, let's inshallah move to, because understand, the reason I gave you all of this example is so you can first understand their point of view. Because if you do not understand, and let me say this thing, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, all of these famous atheists, you go and watch any of their debates. This is the summary of whatever they have to offer in order to refute existence of God. And in a nutshell, whatever they are saying, I have given that to you. Now let's dissect all of that. Let's see that why they are saying all of this and where they are operating from. So in our response, we would say that this objection is based on three primary assumptions. Number one, natural phenomenon can either be explained via supernatural, as ancient people used to do, or you can explain it through natural processes as science doing today. So there's a either or. In other words, they are mutually exclusive. There's a dichotomy here. If natural processes can explain something, then there is no need for supernatural explanation. That is first assumption. In other words, there is a conflict between God and science. Clear? And God is representing supernatural, and science is representing natural. And second assumption, this is very important, that atheism was the default position of mankind. In other words, there was no such a thing as belief in God. Rather, belief in God is a social construct, because there are two things, something by default and something which comes as a social construct, which come with the passage of time. So this is their very key assumption on which this objection is based, that atheism is a default position of human beings. and belief in God came out of ignorance and fear. Clear? And third assumption, belief in God is not based on evidence. Clear? These are the three assumptions. If you reflect on all of those objections, which I tried to explain through those two examples of rainfall and solar eclipse, actually these objections or any of their objections, they are based on these assumptions. And understand this way of refutation. There is something called undercutting defeat, and that means that if you are able to address the underlying and the underpinning assumptions and you basically destroy them, then anything which is based on that foundation collapses automatically. Then you don't need to answer every single question or every single objection, because those objections are based on something, and they are based primarily on these three things. Clear? Now let's see inshallah these assumptions, and let's deal with them one by one. First and foremost, this dichotomy that either natural explanation or supernatural explanation, there's a dichotomy. Choose which one you want to go for. Clear? So point number one, in order to address this first assumption, you are conflating how question with the why and who questions. What it means, let's understand. Knowing how a machine is functioning does not lead to the conclusion that no one made it. Just take this whole cosmos, this entire universe, as a gigantic machine, which once upon a time we have no knowledge that how this machine is functioning. And now with the passage of time, we are learning the mechanics and the mechanism of this machine. But what is the connection here? If you understand how something is functioning, how can you base on this say that no one made this thing? Please explain for us. There's no connection here. Let me explain it further. There's a difference between discovering something and making something. For example, Newton, the father of modern physics. Newton did not cause the gravitational force to come into existence. Rather, he merely discovered a phenomena which had been there all along. I mean, think about this. Did Newton put this phenomenon of gravitational force, or did he discover it? The answer is very obvious. He discovered it. Discovering something does not prove that no one made that. Clear? Let me explain it further. Scientific inquiry is a human effort to discover patterns, regularities and mechanisms in the natural world, and as such, being this thing, it does not negate the cause and purpose of their existence. So yes, we know that there are regularities, patterns and mechanisms in this universe which science is discovering. But what is the cause and purpose of those mechanisms, patterns and regularities? This is not being answered by science, and we are not blaming science, by the way. Science has its domain, which we have discussed in our first topic on this session. First session on this topic, that there is no connection between these two things. Science has its domain, and in that domain it deals with the how question. It does not negate the explanation of who and why. Clear? So that is one point. Secondly, nature of science needs to be understood very clearly, that how science explains things. Let's inshallah understand this process. Science explains one contingent fact through another contingent fact, and then this contingent fact through another contingent fact, and so on and so forth. And we have already identified and clearly defined that what we mean by contingent. I don't need to repeat that because we have discussed these two key terms. One thing is contingent and other is necessary. Contingent means, simply in simple terms, contingent means something which is dependent, and necessary means something independent. And any existence, any event around us can fall in either of these two categories. Either it is dependent or contingent, or it is independent or self-sufficient, or which we call necessary. So necessary, contingent. Contingent means dependent, necessary means independent. So science explains one dependent fact through another dependent fact, and then that dependent fact through another dependent fact, and so on and so forth. Let's understand with one example. If there's a phenomena which we call, for example, blowing of the wind. Okay, this is a natural phenomena, blowing of the wind. Now if you ask question, why does the wind blow? Clear? So science will give you this answer, that wind is the movement of air caused by uneven heating of the earth by the sun. Uneven heating of the earth by the sun causes wind to blow. There you go. You got your answer. But is this answer just ends explanation? No. Because now the question is, what makes the heating of the earth uneven? Okay, so let's see. Uneven heating of the earth. Why? Science tells us that because land heats faster than water, and this causes air to warm, expand and rise over land, while it cools and sinks over the cooler water surfaces. So this is the reason science is giving you that why heating of the earth is uneven. In a nutshell, that water surfaces and other dry surfaces, they have difference in terms of being heated by the heat of the sun. So this is what causes this heat to be uneven. Okay, but the question is, what causes sun to produce heat? So let's ask science. Science will tell you that it is because of what we call nuclear fusion, which is simply hydrogen is changed to helium, and this nuclear fusion creates heat and photons. There you go, you got the answer. But then you ask further question, that why is the case that you have these photons, and what is the mechanics of these photons? And you can see my point, and that's why I just put it these dots, so you can understand that you can keep moving. So this is what I mean by what I said on the previous page, on the previous slide, that science does explain, there's no doubt about that, but science explains one dependent thing through another dependent thing, and then you need to explain that second dependent thing through a third dependent thing, and so on and so forth. And this is the reason we have said in our previous session that universe is a series of contingent objects or events. Clear? So this is the nature of scientific explanation. Now let's see that what we draw from this one. Now they would ask that what is the problem? Yes, we understand this, that science explains one thing through a second thing, and the second thing through a third thing, and so on. What is the problem? Now let's point out the problem. First of all, we'll say that the problem is, no matter how far you go in this inquiry or in this scientific adventure, no matter how far you go, any explanation you bring for a previous effect, it will need another explanation. as I just demonstrated from the example of rainfall, the blowing of the wind. Same is the example that if you keep moving in any area, if you keep moving, you can never end. That's the key point. You can never end. And they would say, so what? Yes, science is a never-ending journey of discovering our universe. So what is the problem in this one? Now let's inshallah we see that what is the problem in this one, and that is our key premise to identify this problem. There can never be an infinite series of contingent events. You can never go in this way. It's impossible. Is it impossible? Yes, it is impossible. And inshallah, I explain to you that why is it impossible. Now, if it is impossible, and inshallah I show you that why is it impossible. If it is impossible to have an infinite series of contingent events, then you have only two options. Option one, eventually you end your inquiry or explanation at a contingent event. Eventually you have to end somewhere. Okay? Or second option is that you posit a necessary fact to explain and make the entire chain and the entire series of contingent events true. So there are two options. Either you end your inquiry somewhere in this chain of contingent explanation, or you posit a necessary fact, and because of that necessary fact, everything is eventually explained. Now I know that what I have mentioned on this slide is it needs to be explained, especially this point, that why I am saying this, that there can never be an infinite series of contingent events. Clear? Let's inshallah understand this one. You know, in the field of mathematics, for example, so in the field of mathematics, you have this, for example, let's suppose you are a mathematician, okay, and you come up with a theorem and you present your theorem. And if you have studied mathematics, when they present any theorem, they base their theorem on something which has been presented before this theorem. For example, you presented theorem A. This theorem A is explained to theorem B, and this theorem B is explained through theorem C, and this theorem C is explained through theorem D. You keep moving. Eventually a point comes when you say that that's it. Now there are some axioms, and these axioms, they explain all of these theorems. So it can never be the case, and it is definitely not the case, that theorem explained through theorem, explained through theorem, explained through theorem, and ad infinite. It will never happen, and it does not happen in the field of mathematics. You always go and end every explanation on the axioms. And axiom by definition, please pay attention, axiom by definition, by necessity, are self-contained. Something that need not to be explained, and they explain everything else. So we are presenting our first evidence, first piece of evidence or first piece of argument in order to establish this point that you can never have an infinite series of contingent objects, rather it ends somewhere on necessary. So theorems are necessary, axioms are necessary, and theorems are contingent. Now we ask any person, because mathematics is the bone of whole scientific enterprise. Okay, now you can ask any mathematician that is it possible to only have theorems and not have any axioms? Please ask this question. I have asked this one, you try as well. And the answer is no. There are always theorems and axioms. Theorems are contingent and axioms are self-explained or necessary. Without axioms, please pay attention, if we do not have this axiom, none of this theorem is true. None of them. Because the truth of each theorem is based on the other theorem, and eventually all of that is based on axioms. That is one piece of evidence. Let's inshallah move on, and let me give you a second example. I gave this example last time as well, but because it is relevant. Okay, for example, that if you are investigating a slander, okay, and this is you, okay, so this person, Mr. A, okay, you ask him that why did you say such and such, and he says that Mr. B has told me. And you ask Mr. B, why did you say such and such? He says, for example, in this one I only took 3 people, but you can keep moving. For example, Mr. B says that Mr. C told me. Mr. C says that Mr. D told me. Now let me ask you a question. Please think about this. Can it go this way forever? Impossible, because there will eventually be a guy in this my example, in this image, this third guy is the one. He is the origin. He is the origin of all of this slander. He is the guy who independently made this choice to spread this slander, and then everybody else is taking this from it. Now please pay attention. Number 1, this series cannot go forever. Eventually there has to be a guy who originated the slander, number 1. And number 2, please understand this point. If you remove this guy, can you ever explain any slander? In this case, impossible. Because A says that B has told me. Now in one sense you got your explanation, that A is telling you that Mr. B has told me. In one sense it is an explanation, but is it really explanation? Would you stop here? Would you not go to B and ask him? So this is what we are saying, that number 1, there can never be an infinite chain of and by the way, in this case you can understand the concept of contingent as well, because this guy's information or slander is dependent on this guy, and this guy is on this guy, and eventually this guy is the original source. In this example, these guys are contingent, and this guy is the necessary foundation of this slander. Okay, now one more example. Look at this one. It's a image of falling dominoes. It's a moving image of falling dominoes. Please pay attention to this one. Okay, now you watch this one. Now let me explain my point on the basis of this one. This first domino which is falling, just imagine, please pay attention, just imagine that this first domino which is knocking off this second domino, second is knocking off the third domino. Now just imagine that this series of dominoes was infinite, which means that before this, which we are calling the first domino, if this was going forever in the past, please understand this point very clearly. If this series was going forever in the past, which means it is infinite, can this first domino fall? In this picture, this first domino can never fall. You know why? Because in order for this first domino to fall, infinite number of dominoes before it have to fall, and infinite number of domino would always be falling, and as a result this domino would never be able to fall. And likewise you can say this thing about any of these dominoes, that if a domino has infinite number of dominoes before it, then infinite number of dominoes have to fall before this domino will fall. And because infinite number of domino will never be finished be falling, so this domino will never be able to be fall. Once again, understand this problem, because this is the you can say the cop out. This is the exit where atheists try to exit. They say that this series is infinite. Clear? So in this example and in all the other example, I just try to highlight this point, that this series of dominoes can, so this series of dominoes can never be going infinitely in the past, because if it was the case, then this domino would never ever be able to fall, because in order for this domino to fall, infinite number of dominoes before it have to fall. An infinite number of dominoes would always be falling, and there would never come a time when this domino will fall. Clear? And if you really reflect on this one, none of the dominoes actually will fall. Think about this, because for any single domino in the chain to fall, what is the condition? Infinite number of dominoes have to fall. Clear? So in reality, this chain will never be able to start falling. This is what I'm saying again and again in all of these examples, that number one, there can never be an infinite or never ending series of contingent events, because in this example, falling of a domino is a contingent event. Why? Because every fall is dependent on the fall before it. Clear? So in all of these examples, what we are concluding is on this slide. Okay, let's see that what we have got on this one. It says that the self-explained, which we want axioms, which ultimately explain everything else. Okay, necessary fact is a self-explained axiom which ultimately explains everything else, and contingent facts are rooted in the necessary fact, and it is, and in the absence of necessary fact, they do not have any explanatory power. For example, let me explain both of these 2 points from the same thing. Please pay attention. I said that without necessary fact or necessary explanation, contingent explanations have no meanings. They really don't explain anything, to be honest. For example, in this example, this guy, when this guy says, this Mr. A says that I heard this thing from Mr. B. Now in one sense, it is an explanation. Clear? But it did not really explain anything until you get to this guy. Explanation of these people are rooted in this guy. This guy is the necessary explanation, and these guys are contingent explanation. So this is what I mean on that slide, that without this guy, these explanations have no power. They have not really explained anything. All of these explanations are contingent on this one. So from this, what I'm trying to get at is, now this is the conclusion of all of these 15 minutes of discussion. Please pay attention. Scientific explanations are contingent explanations. A contingent explanation cannot go forever. I have showed you. It has to end somewhere. Clear? And this is what we are saying, that yes, science does give you explanation, but it is not any different than this explanation where this guy says I have heard from this one. Why? Because this is dependent, and this dependent explanation has to end on ultimate explanation. This guy is called ultimate explanation, and these guys are called contingent explanation. Clear? So this is what I mean by all of these things. Now, as you can see in this image as well, that there has to be a necessary foundation or a necessary fact, and because of this, all of these rest of the facts are gaining their power of explanation. So this 1, 2, 3, 4, this is what we call by scientific explanation, and this is what we call by God explanation. Now let's explain it further, inshallah, to summarize the whole concept. Scientific explanation is, number one, it is a foreground explanation. You know, we have the concept of background and foreground. Clear? So scientific explanation is a foreground which is apparent, which is in front of your eyes. This is what science explains, and it is called proximate explanation. What it means is, if you go to same example, you see that when this guy and this guy, so this guy explaining it through this guy in a proximate way. So we call that scientific explanation is a foreground explanation, or it is called proximate explanation. Okay, but in opposite to that, God explanation is a background explanation. Okay, and this is called ultimate explanation. Inshallah, let's conclude this with a couple of more slides so I can take your question as well, because this is very important. You have to be engaged. So let me conclude this whole discussion. Science and religion, they coexist, and they have coexisted in the past. We need science to further our understanding of the functioning of the universe, but we also need God and His religion to live a life of true peace and eternal bliss. So both of these things are working together. Science is working in its domain and giving us the proximate explanation, foreground explanation, and religion is working and giving us the background explanation or ultimate explanation. So in this way, there is no way to say that either scientific explanation or God explanation.